Olli, and today's guest here with me, so we're ready to roll. Welcome to our Circular Coffee Break podcast, where we will be casually talking about everything circular and beyond. As always, the podcast is for all of you listeners out there, and we're eager to hear your thoughts and ideas. Maybe you have some future guests you would like to hear on the podcast, or you have some topics where you would be eager to hear more and learn more about. So please feel free to drop us a note, either directly on our webpage, circularcoffeebreak.com, or via email at circularcoffeebreak@gmail.com. We're always eager to hear from you and to further develop the themes, the topics, the things we're talking about to make it as relevant as possible for all of you out there listening. Now, without further ado, let's get started. My guest today is a junior researcher in the area of sustainability science at the LUT University in Lappeenranta, even though I learned earlier that he's not in Lappeenranta today, but in the capital region. Before his current role, he has worked as a project worker in the development and implementation of SISU, an online system for planning and administration of university studies, and as a part-time teacher for engineering, mathematics, and technical computing courses, both at the LUT University. He also worked as a junior BI consultant at Profit Software. Really looking forward to our conversation today. Welcome to the show, Olli Helppi.
Thank you, Michael. Very happy to be here today.
Great. And we talked a little bit before we pressed record. I'm really excited about today's topic because I think it's really relevant and really timely. We will be talking about the positive impact that companies are making, will be making, and how they can actually measure that. And you have been part of the development of the Handprint concept and framework, which is exactly looking into that, and which is a collaborative effort of actually over 8 years, led by VTT and LUT University. Now, to get us started and to give our listeners an idea, could you give us a short introduction to the project, but also the Handprint project concept and framework?
Definitely. So the project itself is called Carbon Neutrality Empowered by Handprint. And during the project, we have been concentrating on developing a method for determining the handprint of circular economy, as well as assessing the role of carbon handprints in the context of carbon neutrality. My focus has been on the latter. And at this point, it's probably good to define what a carbon handprint is. So to put it short, a solution has a carbon handprint if it reduces the carbon footprint of someone else than yourself. And this is usually looked at between a solution provider and a customer, where the solution provider produces a handprint if it manages to reduce the carbon footprint of its customer. And the solution in this case refers basically to a product or a service.
And specifically, I guess naturally now in the context of the discussion around greenwashing and how companies can actually show the positive impact they have, it's really important to have a scientific basis or a foundation that is that people can look at and understand and compare between different companies. So from that point of view, I think it's a really important activity. Now, one of the things you basically concluded is that there is a need to update regulation and guidelines to better account for the positive impacts of companies. From your point of view and from your studies, what are the limitations and shortcomings of the current climate target frameworks that you see?
Yeah, so we have been looking at these various climate pledge frameworks that are created for corporate entities to use. There have been published a bunch of these in the past decade or so, and typically these frameworks follow the structure where they define a climate target, such as a carbon neutrality or net zero emissions, and then also define a pathway on reaching that target. And a company, for example, following such a framework, they define a target to reach carbon neutrality during a defined timeline, and then that framework gives them the path towards that goal. And examples of such frameworks include the Science-Based Targets Initiative Corporate Net Zero Standard, the ISO 14068 standard about climate change management, which is being finalized, Carbon Neutral Protocol, PAS 2016-60, among others. There are a lot of these. And in general, these frameworks follow the same principle structure. If a company wants to become carbon neutral or net zero, they should reduce their carbon footprint as much as possible over a defined period of time. And what is then left, not mitigated after that timeline, should be offset by purchasing and retiring these carbon credits. And these frameworks seem to follow this common idea that the global system will become carbon neutral if each individual part of that system, in this case a company, becomes carbon neutral within their own boundary. While this sounds logical, in practice this is hindered by the fact that most companies to date are not setting these targets, and also emissions from some companies matter more than from others. And other companies have more capability to influence their own emissions, while then again some companies may have the strength in reducing emissions elsewhere.
Yeah, I think you're making a very important point there. If you look at each company on their own, naturally you can argue if each company gets the best results themselves, then you optimize the system. But in a world that's heavily interrelated and where you have global value chains and relationships between companies and individuals and all of that, the model, this simplification is just not really feasible in that context. And then I guess that is where then the handprint, as you said, is looking at how can you influence positively the CO2 footprint of your customers or of other people along the value chain. Now, in the context of a soon-to-be published paper, you have been working with 2 case studies to outline the benefits of assessing the positive impacts. One is in waste management, and the other case is in the energy production. From these 2 cases, if you look at those, what were the main findings you had when looking specifically at these 2 industries?
Yes, so the first case study considers a manufacturing company that changes its waste management service to one with lower emissions. In practice, this means that the waste trucks that previously used fossil fuel to provide the service to manage the waste then move on to using renewable diesel. And this results in a reduced footprint from the manufacturing company, and more specifically in its scope 3 emissions. And well, greenhouse gas emissions of a company are divided into 3 scopes. Scope 1 includes the direct emissions from the company activity. In other words, those that come out of either the chimneys of buildings or the tailpipes of company cars. Scope 2 are emissions from purchased energy, and Scope 3 are emissions from activities done by assets that are not owned by the company, but for which the company is directly responsible for, such as the upstream emissions of products and services consumed by the company. And Scope 3 emissions have the intriguing property that they can be double counted. In the case example, this is illustrated by the fact that if the waste management company reduces their direct Scope 1 emissions by 1 ton, the same amount of emissions are reduced from the Scope 3 of the manufacturing company. So both footprints kind of get the benefit. But if further down the value chain that waste is then transported to a waste to energy company, that company now has reduced emissions from fuel sourcing, and its footprint is also reduced in the Scope 3. And even further, a company now that uses that a bit cleaner energy that was provided by the waste to energy company, the energy user also has a reduced footprint in the scope 3. And this results in basically two phenomena. Firstly, if one company reduces its emissions, this may benefit other companies' carbon footprints regardless if they had any initiative in that reduction. And second, if we look at reductions in companies' carbon footprints, scope 3 emissions, we don't know how much emissions have actually been reduced from reaching the atmosphere, since some of those emissions may actually be from the same reduction in its origin point. And the conclusion in this case is that since there can be multiple companies who have the same emission in their scope 3, there is ambiguity in which one should take the action to reduce that emission. Furthermore, if we look at changes of companies' scope 3 emissions, that does not tell us what is actually happening in the greenhouse gas flows to the atmosphere.
Interesting. And I guess you can also turn that around naturally, because the positive impact of one company can easily be the negative impact of the next one, as you're basically just pushing emissions between companies. And as you said, specifically in the scope 1 and scope 3 discussion, that's a consideration when doing the optimization. Have you seen any solutions, any approaches to address that sub-optimization of the total environmental impact in the two case studies? When you think about scope 1, scope 3, and basically looking at the emissions, I guess, along the value chain from one company to the other.
This idea relates a bit more to the second case example in our study, which is about energy production. And in that case, we look at an energy producer who originally produces energy by burning oil in a furnace, fossil oil. And they change their method of production to a gas engine, which uses a biogas as a fuel. And this then leads to a reduction in scope 1 emissions of that energy producer. But now, as somebody has to provide that solution to the energy producer, the gas engine, the company that provides that equipment now has a new customer, and the company has to increase its production by that one gas engine unit. And this results in an increased carbon footprint for the equipment provider, specifically from the manufacture, transport, and use of that gas engine. And this is a type of a catch-22. In order for a company to reduce its emissions, another has to increase its emissions. And in such a case, we have to look at the system that includes both of these companies and see whether the total flow of emissions is reduced. So even though this solution increases the provider's footprint by some amount, that increase can be justified if it results in a greater reduction in the customer's emissions.
So I guess you've been working with the companies that directly in these cases. How did they basically, when they participated, when they saw the results, when they basically followed the outcomes, how did they react? What was their take, and how did they adjust their behavior potentially, or considered adjustments in their operations, in their behavior?
Well, we haven't yet heard about how they might have adjusted their actions, but they did find the results interesting. And well, it comes to if we communicated the results properly and if they understood what these findings properly, that's of course something that we don't actually know. But nevertheless, they found the results interesting.
How do you see the broader application of this? Because, I mean, you've now done two case studies in two industries that are very interesting, I guess, in the context of environmental impact, energy and waste management. How do you see the broader application of both the handprint but also the findings of these case studies? Do you have any thoughts of what companies can learn from this in their own operations?
Well, many companies are already calculating their carbon footprints as they are interested in reducing their climate impacts. And I think companies could benefit from calculating the handprints that result from their business as well. Because if a company recognizes its potential for both reducing its own footprint and creating handprints, it can evaluate whether its strengths lie on either side. For a company that already has a small footprint, decreasing its footprint further can be difficult and costly. That company might, however, have the ability to reduce its customers' footprint significantly. And I think a good example of this is if we compare an energy consultant company and, let's say, an energy producer. An energy consultant company is likely to have relatively low emissions that result from using computers, maybe driving a car to a customer, but they don't have big buildings that spew out flue gases, whereas a energy producing company is incinerating something usually, and something comes out of a lot of greenhouse gas emissions come out of the chimney. So if we give the same rules to these companies, so like reduce your carbon footprint as much as possible, and basically that's it. The energy consultant company reducing its own footprint makes relatively little difference to the global climate versus the energy producer, who definitely should try to make everything to reduce its footprint. But then again, that energy consultant company may have a lot of tools to help energy producing companies to reduce their footprints, and other companies as well, by helping them to increase energy efficiency or adapt new technologies. So the question comes down to, if the company has a euro to spend in either reducing its own footprint or having an effect on its customers' footprints, where is that euro the most rationally spent? And I think it is not every time the reduction of a company's own footprint where that the euro gives the best results considering these global climate targets.
That's a really interesting observation you point out there, because over the years I had a lot of discussions specifically with services companies that have been struggling for a long time already with the concept of the carbon footprint, because they want to do something positive, but as you said, I mean, they have an office. And then maybe some commuting, and then the heating and cooling of their office space. But that's basically the footprint they have. So to optimize that is basically, reducing the room temperature from 21 degrees to 15 degrees, and basically asking people to commute to the office by bike or by public transport. And that's pretty much what they can do. At the same time, when they shift their service portfolio, and they basically help their customers in the context of their projects to be more environmentally friendly, to reduce their carbon footprint, to reduce their impact. That's naturally much more impactful, and an investment into that area would basically drive a significantly higher impact than it would in reducing their own footprint. So I fully agree. Do you see a difference, or do you see that reflection of service companies also in your example versus producing companies, where the handprint might even be outweighing the footprint from an impact point of view?
Well, I do not have any straight examples of such a company, but I think it is definitely possible. Well, for example, I think the consultant company is a good example, because they likely have emissions from their activities, but the amount of handprint that they can produce is basically limited by the number of customers they have. And by getting more customers, they now have more potential to produce handprint for those using those customers. So this highlights the interesting thing about carbon footprint and handprint. The carbon footprint basically has a lower limit, that's zero. And once you reach that zero, is that the end of your climate action? Well, it doesn't need to be, because you can still continue reducing footprints of others, so you can still provide handprints.
Yeah, it's interesting because for a lot of companies currently the main target is to be net zero. The main target is to reduce their footprint as much as possible, but not necessarily look at the positive side of things where they could actually then help their customers or help society at large to reduce their footprint, to reduce their impacts. One interesting side note: I had a discussion with a company in France actually some time back, and what they told me is that the terminology footprint and handprint doesn't work in France because they don't use the term footprint for the negative side of the environmental impact. So for them, the term handprint is very difficult because there's no counterpart to it on the negative side. So the company was actually thinking about how could they establish with their customer base, but also with the wider society, this idea of footprint and handprint. So that's maybe something we need to think about, how to make this a global thing that everyone understands, this positive negative connotation in this context. Now, if our listeners out there are thinking, so I understand all of what Ole and Michael have been talking about, but how can I impact my foot and handprint? Do you have any experience, ideas from your research and from the work in the handprint project on how companies can influence their handprint and footprint to create a positive impact at the end of the day? Are there some learnings that you could share that our listeners could consider in their own organizations, in their own companies, beyond what we already talked about?
Well, of course, the question of how can a company influence its own carbon footprint is the age-old one. How a company can, of course, influence its carbon footprint by reducing emissions from its activities. And that is kind of the status quo of corporate climate action, and that is where the focus is being put in corporations. In the case of handprints, the most obvious ways and most easily calculatable ways are designing products, selling products that have the ability to reduce the footprint relative to some other product that your customer might have. And the same goes for service. So a clear example of this is probably a car. So many people drive cars, so car companies have a lot of customers. So by designing a lower emission car, let's say an electric vehicle over a diesel vehicle, that can be an example of a product that can have a carbon handprint in case of that customer replacing his or her old diesel car, for example, with that electric vehicle. And this is a great question in the context of these climate pledge frameworks that I gave a bit of a background in the beginning, because these climate pledge frameworks mainly consider two methods of corporate climate action, which are reducing their own footprint and emissions offsetting. And to put it briefly, emissions offsetting is based on purchasing these carbon credits that are created in projects that aim to reduce emissions somewhere or remove carbon from the atmosphere. And there are various different types of these projects, and many of them suffer from various problems that result in underperformance of those projects. And this means if a company buys a carbon credit that promises to reduce 1 ton of emissions somewhere, it is uncertain if that amount is actually reduced, or in some cases, if there is any reduction at all. And we think that positive impacts could be added to that company toolbox as a third method. And if a company calculates a handprint for its product, it means that it has received and evaluated the necessary data from its stakeholders, mainly the customer. And as the customer is also interested in reducing its footprint, there is mutual interest in verifying the accuracy of the handprint calculation. Therefore, it can be verified that after adopting the solution, there are actually less emissions ending up in the atmosphere. And in the case of offsetting, verifying the actual effect of one carbon credit can be more difficult, as is evident from the criticism emissions offsetting has received in research literature, but also in journalistic media. And furthermore, offsetting is always a cost for a company. It doesn't directly benefit its business, whereas producing a handprint is a business opportunity for a company. If a company reduces a ton of emissions from its customer, it does so by selling something, resulting in profits. If a company offsets a ton of emissions, it bought something and lost money as a result, and that money is away from investments towards its business. And thus I think that offsetting should be the last resort tool in a company's toolbox. Offsetting, especially in the case of carbon removals, is recognized as essential even by the IPCC, but direct reductions in footprints, be it your own or your customers, should be pursued before resorting to offsets.
Absolutely, and in that sense, it's actually pretty much a hierarchy, isn't it? You should first look at basically either reducing your footprint or creating a positive handprint, and only then look at offsetting if there's really no other possibility. But then footprint and handprint should be equally considered in that context, as both basically impact the overall environmental impacts of a company or a value chain or a society in that context. So it's very, very interesting. And as you said, there has been a lot of criticism around offsetting and companies basically buying their way out of action in that context, or some of the projects even not really creating the offset you're looking for. So handprint definitely is a very positive alternative. I also like what you said about this being a business opportunity. And I think that is something that more and more companies need to start realizing, that from a commercial point of view, the handprint actually is a very viable option to differentiate in the market, to help your customers, to create value for your customers, and with that basically translate that into a commercial success at the end of the day, and a positive commercial impact on top of the positive environmental impact. Now, at the top of the show, we said this has been an 8-year journey developing the handprint, and I think it has been 3 different projects that actually have been building on top of each other to arrive where we are today with the handprint concept and framework. And that work is now coming to an end. And I understand there will be a final seminar on the 14th of February that people can still register to, if they want to hear more about the project, about the handprint, about utilizing it. Where can they find more information about the project and about the event?
Yeah, just to be clear, the research regarding handprints is definitely not coming to an end, and the handprint as a concept is just beginning its journey. But this project surely is coming to an end, and we do have the final seminar at 14th of February. Well, I will be posting the invite to that seminar on my LinkedIn, and you can always ask me for the invite directly through email at olli.helppi@lut.fi. Those will be the main channels I will be at least messaging the final seminar.
Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot. And I guess we will also link the handprint.fi webpage in the show notes when the episode is released, so you can also go there. There's actually the guidebook available there that has a lot of information around the methodology, around the approach, around how you can even use it in your own context in there. So the coffee is empty. It's time to wrap up the episode of the Circular Coffee Break. Thanks a lot, Olli, for joining me today. I think there's really a lot to talk about when it comes to the positive impacts that companies can create. And I think the handprint methodology, the handprint approach is actually an attempt to standardize, to create a scientific basis to that, to make it comparable between companies, which I mentioned earlier, the greenwashing directive. I think specifically in that context, it's critical for companies to find ways to get away from marketing claims and get to something that has a scientific data foundation to it that people can actually follow up. So thanks a lot for joining me today and for talking about the handprint and the research you've been doing.
Thank you very much, Michael.
For all of you listening out there, we hope today's episode was interesting, inspiring for you. You got some new ideas. As said, head over to the webpage, handprint.fi, to learn more about the methodology, and maybe you can use it in the context of your own operations, of your own organization. And as Olli said, you can also reach out to him if you want to learn more or if you're interested to embed the methodology into your project. If you like the podcast, you can help us out in growing the Circular Coffee Break community by giving us a 5-star rating and a positive review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you're basically getting your podcast dose of the day. So that would be great. And we're always looking to extend the community, get more people to learn about circularity, about sustainable business. So we would really like to hear from you. We are now also on YouTube and on Medium, so also head over there, check out our content there. Eager to hear your thoughts about that as well. It's a new way for us to spread the ideas and the content from our guests, from our discussions here. So interested to hear from you about that, if that's helpful, if you like the content, if you have some more ideas there. Also, please remember to subscribe to stay in the loop. There's a lot of new guests coming up for the second season of the Circular Coffee Break. Every 2 weeks, there's new episodes with new interesting guests. Great. All that's left for me is to thank you for listening today and for being with us. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all here at the Circular Coffee Break podcast.